On a quiet, desolate road, the night air was cool, and the only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a cricket. It was the kind of night that felt still, almost eerie, as if time itself had slowed down. Lieutenant Jake Miller sat in his patrol car, idly listening to the crackling static of his police radio. He had driven this route countless times, yet tonight, something gnawed at him, a restlessness he couldn't shake. Jake had always taken pride in his role as a protector of the law, but deep down he carried a darkness, an ingrained prejudice, one that had been cultivated over years of absorbing the quiet nods of approval from older officers when they saw him act on his biases. The way his father spoke about those people and the stories shared in hushed tones at the precinct. It wasn't something he ever questioned, it simply was. As far as he was concerned, he was doing his job, and anyone who challenged that was automatically suspect. As he drove down the empty road, he spotted something that caught his attention: a sleek black sedan parked awkwardly on the shoulder. Its engine was still running, and the faint glow of a cigarette illuminated a man sitting inside. Instantly, Jake's senses sharpened. It was unusual to see anyone out here at this hour, especially someone who appeared to be waiting for something or someone. The car's tinted windows prevented Jake from getting a clear view of the driver, but a sense of suspicion flared within him. Jake's pulse quickened as he flipped on his lights and pulled over behind the sedan, his tires crunching on the gravel. He took a deep breath, his mind already spinning with assumptions about who this person might be and what they were up to. Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped out of his patrol car and adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his gun pressing against his hip. As he approached the driver's side window, he noticed the man inside, black, broad-shouldered, with a calm, almost unbothered expression, as if this encounter was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Good evening," Jake began, his tone carrying an edge. "Is there a reason you're parked out here?" The man looked up, his eyes meeting Jake's without a hint of fear. "Just taking a break," he replied smoothly, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Long day at work." "License and registration," Jake demanded, his voice a little sharper now, as his irritation began to bubble up. The man complied, slowly reaching into his glove compartment. Jake's eyes narrowed as he scanned the documents, lingering on the name, Chris Walker. "This your car?" Jake asked, even though the registration clearly said it was. "Yes, officer," Chris replied. "Everything should be in order." Jake felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. Something about this man's calm demeanor, his lack of deference, grated on him. He leaned in closer, shining his flashlight directly into Chris's eyes. "And what kind of work keeps you out here at this hour?" Chris took a moment as if weighing his response. "Government work," he finally said, maintaining eye contact. There was no arrogance in his tone, but neither was there fear. Just a simple, unflinching truth that made Jake's skin crawl. "Step out of the vehicle," Jake ordered, his patience wearing thin. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" Chris asked, still calm but now with a slight edge to his voice. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Out of the car," Jake repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the threat in his voice. Chris sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt and stepping out. As he did, Jake's hand drifted toward his gun, his fingers grazing the grip. He didn't draw it, but the implication was clear. Chris noticed, and something shifted in his expression. He looked at Jake, really looked at him, and for the first time Jake felt a flicker of uncertainty. "You know," Chris said quietly, "I've been in your shoes. Not literally, of course, but I've stood where you're standing, assuming the worst about someone based on nothing more than skin color and a gut feeling. You're profiling me, officer, and we both know it." Jake's eyes flashed with anger. "Watch your tone," he snapped, but the words felt hollow, even to him. "Or what?" Chris challenged, taking a step closer. "You'll do something you'll regret? You think you're the first cop to look at me and see a threat? I've dealt with men like you my entire life, but I'm not the one you need to worry about tonight." Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a mix of anger and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe? Doubt? But he wasn't ready to confront that yet. Not here. Not now. At that moment, a phone rang. Jake turned, startled, as another car pulled up behind his cruiser. A middle-aged woman stepped out, worry etched across her face. "Jake, what are you doing?" she called, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It was Emily, Jake's wife. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded, his authority slipping. "I got a call from Tom," Emily said, glancing at Chris. "He said you might be in trouble." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. "Tom?" he repeated, feeling the ground shift beneath him. Tom, who had grown up with Chris. Tom, who knew every corner of this town and every face that passed through it. Tom, who was always telling Jake he needed to open his eyes and see the world for what it really was. "Yeah, Tom," Emily said, stepping forward. "He told me who you were about to pull over." She turned to Chris, offering a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about this. I truly am." "It's fine," Chris said, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "I've dealt with worse." Jake felt his world tilt. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was in control. He was the one with the authority. But now, standing here, with his wife's worried eyes on him, and this man who refused to be cowed, he felt something break inside him. "Jake," Emily said softly, "you need to listen to him." "I don't need to listen to anyone," Jake snapped. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He looked at Chris, really looked at him, and saw not a threat, but a man. Tired, angry, but not beaten. And for the first time in his life, Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The other officers arrived not long after, a trio of them stepping out of the unmarked car, their faces hard and unreadable. Jake recognized them, his colleagues, his brothers in blue. But as they approached, he saw something in their eyes, a flicker of something cold and dangerous. "Everything okay here?" one of them asked, and Jake felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at Chris, then back at his fellow officers, and suddenly he knew in his bones, that he was standing at a crossroads. "Yeah," Jake said slowly, stepping in front of Chris. "Everything's fine. This man hasn't done anything wrong." The other officers exchanged a glance, and Jake felt the weight of their judgment, their silent expectation that he would fall in line, do what was expected. But something in him had shifted, something that refused to be silenced. "Let him go," Jake said, his voice steady, for the first time in years feeling like he was speaking with true authority. "He's not the one we should be worried about." And just like that, the tension shattered, leaving only the cold night air and the distant hum of the highway. Emily reached out, taking Jake's hand, and he squeezed back, feeling the warmth, the strength in her grip. He looked at Chris, who nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of what had just passed between them. The other officers retreated, muttering under their breath, but Jake didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. He turned to Chris, ready to ask for forgiveness, for guidance, for something, anything. But Chris just shook his head. "We've got work to do," he said, and Jake nodded, understanding. This was just the beginning. The drive to the safe house felt endless. Jake, Chris, and Emily rode in silence, the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on them like a heavy shroud. The night was darker now, the sky an inky black that seemed to swallow the world whole. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. Every bump in the road, every flicker of movement in the darkness outside set his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that any moment a pair of headlights would appear behind them, bringing with it the wrath of his former colleagues. Emily glanced at her husband, her fingers resting lightly on his arm. She could feel the tremors running through him, the fear that was just beneath the surface. "Jake," she said softly, "you did the right thing back there." "Did I?" he muttered, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I've never felt so lost in my life, Em. Everything I thought I knew." "You made a choice," Chris interjected from the back seat, his voice calm, steady. "A choice that most people in your position wouldn't have had the courage to make. But we're not out of this yet. Those officers, they're not going to let this slide." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "What happens now?" "Now, we gather everything we have," Chris replied. "Evidence, testimonies, anything that can expose what's been happening. If we don't act fast, they'll bury this, just like they buried everything else." As they pulled up to a small, nondescript cabin at the end of a winding dirt road, Jake felt a surge of anxiety. The place was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, and the only light came from a dim bulb hanging above the door. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in a movie about people who disappeared and were never seen again. But there was no turning back now. They had made their choice, and this was the only path forward. Inside, the safe house was cramped and musty, with old furniture and the faint smell of mildew. Tom was already there, waiting for them. He stood as they entered, his expression grim. "You made it," he said, his eyes flickering to Jake, appraising him. "I wasn't sure if you'd actually go through with it." "Neither was I," Jake admitted, running a hand through his hair. "What's the plan?" Tom nodded towards a large table covered in stacks of files, a laptop, and a series of small recording devices. "This is everything we've managed to gather over the years," he said. "It's not just your precinct, Jake. It's bigger than that. There's a network, officers, lawyers, even judges, people who've been protecting each other, covering up their crimes, and making sure that anyone who gets in their way is silenced." Jake stared at the files, the enormity of it all crashing down on him. He'd known there were problems, known that corruption existed, but he had never imagined it went this deep. "And you've been working on this all this time?" he asked, turning to Chris. Chris nodded. "Ever since I joined the FBI? It started with a single case, an innocent man framed for a crime he didn't commit. When I dug deeper, I found connections leading back to your precinct. That's when I went undercover, trying to get close enough to gather the evidence we'd need to take them down." Jake's head spun. "Why didn't you just arrest them?" "Because it's not that simple," Chris said. "They have connections everywhere. People willing to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and even commit murder to protect themselves. If we're going to bring them down, we need to do it all at once. Expose every last one of them." Emily moved to the table, picking up one of the files and flipping through it. "And how do we do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of fear and determination. "We build a case," Tom said. "We gather every piece of evidence we can find, recordings, documents, anything that proves their involvement. And then we take it to the FBI, the media, anyone who will listen. If we make enough noise, they won't be able to ignore it." They worked through the night, poring over the files, recording testimonies, and piecing together the puzzle that was the corrupt network. Chris guided them, sharing tips on how to structure their case, how to phrase things in a way that would be most compelling, most damning. Emily proved invaluable, her attention to detail catching inconsistencies, spotting patterns, and drawing connections that the others had missed. Jake, for his part, felt like he was in a fog. He followed Chris's instructions, read the files, listened to the recordings, but it all seemed so surreal. Just hours ago, he had been one of them, a part of the system he now sought to dismantle. And as he worked, he couldn't help but wonder if he'd be able to live with himself once this was over. By the time dawn broke, they had compiled a mountain of evidence, enough, Chris assured them, to make a solid case. But as they sat around the table, exhausted and bleary-eyed, a sense of dread hung over them. They knew that the moment they moved to expose the corruption, they'd be painting targets on their backs. The first sign of trouble came just after sunrise. Jake's phone buzzed on the table and he picked it up, frowning. It was one of his colleagues, a man named Officer Reed, someone he had known for years. Jake answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yeah? You think you're smart, don't you?" Reed's voice was cold, dripping with malice. "You think you can just turn on us and walk away?" Jake's blood ran cold. "Reed, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Reed snarled. "You think we don't know where you are? You've got one chance to fix this, Jake. Come back, hand over whatever you've got, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk away." The line went dead, and Jake stared at the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. "They know," he whispered, looking up at Chris and Tom. "They know where we are." "We need to move," Chris said, already gathering the files, his movements quick and practiced. "Now." But before they could leave, they heard it, the distant sound of engines growing louder, closer. Tom rushed to the window, his face pale. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're out of time." They scrambled, grabbing what they could, but there was no escape. Within moments, the cabin was surrounded, beams of light piercing through the windows. Jake could see the silhouettes of men, guns drawn, advancing towards them. His mind raced, panic threatening to consume him. And then, in that moment of utter despair, Emily stepped forward. "Give me the recording," she said, holding out her phone. "The one from last night. It's the only thing they don't know about." Chris hesitated, then handed it over. "What are you gonna do?" "Give them what they want," she said, her voice steady, her eyes blazing with determination. "But not in the way they expect." Emily stepped outside, her phone raised, the recording playing on speaker. The voices of the corrupt officers, clear as day, confessing their crimes, their arrogance laid bare for all to hear. The men froze, their faces contorted with rage and fear. "You want to shoot me?" Emily challenged, her voice echoing in the stillness. "Go ahead. But know that this recording is being streamed live. Even if you kill me, it's too late. The world knows who you are." There was a moment of silence, a moment that stretched into eternity. And then slowly, one by one, the officers lowered their weapons. In the end, it wasn't a gunfight that brought them down. It was the truth, raw, undeniable, and impossible to silence. As the corrupt officers were led away in handcuffs, Jake, Chris, and Emily stood together, battered but unbroken. They had won, but they knew that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The sun was setting by the time they made it to the federal building. Jake's hands were still trembling, his nerves raw from the events of the day. He could barely process the whirlwind of emotions coursing through him. Fear, relief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. As they stepped into the lobby, Chris led the way, his expression set in stone. Emily followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the room, alert for any signs of danger. They approached the main desk and Chris flashed his FBI badge to the receptionist. "We need to see Director Marshall," he said with an air of urgency that left no room for argument. "No. Do you have an appointment?" the receptionist asked, her tone indifferent, clearly accustomed to people demanding immediate attention. Chris leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This is about an internal corruption case involving multiple law enforcement agencies. I suggest you let him know we're here." The receptionist's eyes widened and she quickly picked up the phone, muttering into the receiver. Moments later, an armed guard appeared, gesturing for them to follow. "Director Marshall will see you now," he said, leading them down a series of hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing off the walls. Jake could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Would they be believed? Would the evidence be enough? What if this was just another dead end? The guard finally stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, knocking once before opening it and stepping aside. "They're here, sir," he announced. Director Marshall, a tall, imposing man with graying hair and sharp eyes, stood behind a large mahogany desk. He motioned for them to sit, his gaze sweeping over each of them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You have 5 minutes to convince me why I shouldn't have you removed from this building," he said, his tone brisk, businesslike. Chris wasted no time. He placed the files they'd compiled on the director's desk, the stack thick and worn from hours of handling. "This," he said, "is evidence of a widespread corruption network involving police officers, judges, and even members of this agency. It's been operating for years, right under our noses." Marshall raised an eyebrow, flipping through the pages. "And you expect me to believe that?" "You'll believe it because it's the truth," Emily interjected, her voice steady. "We have recordings, witness statements, and documentation that tie these individuals to a range of illegal activities, from bribery and intimidation to framing innocent people for crimes they didn't commit. We've been working all night to put this together, and if you take even a moment to look through it, you'll see we're not making this up." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "And what makes you think any of this will hold up in court?" "Because it's irrefutable," Chris said firmly. "We didn't just stumble upon this information. It was gathered over years of investigation, corroborated by multiple sources. These are not isolated incidents. They're part of a systemic problem that's been allowed to fester because no one was willing to dig deep enough to expose it." Jake sat there silent, watching as the director sifted through the evidence, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. For the first time since this ordeal began, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. He saw the shift in Marshall's demeanor, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his eyes darted back and forth across the pages, as if piecing together a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for years. Marshall finally looked up, his gaze locking onto Jake. "Lieutenant Miller, is it?" "Yes, sir," Jake replied, sitting up straighter. He felt the weight of the director's scrutiny, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "You were part of this precinct," Marshall said, his voice probing. "Why should I believe you're not just another corrupt cop trying to save his own skin?" Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Because I made a choice," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I chose to stand up against what I knew was wrong. I could have kept my head down, kept pretending I didn't see the things I saw. But I couldn't do it anymore. Not after I realized how many lives were being destroyed because of people like me, people who were too afraid or too complicit to speak up." Marshall studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "You understand that if this goes public, you'll be putting a target on your back. This isn't just about a few bad cops. It's about an entire system that's been rotting from the inside out. Are you prepared to face the consequences?" Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. "I am, sir. Whatever it takes." Marshall sat back, exhaling slowly. "All right," he said, tapping his fingers on the desk. "We'll take this to the Department of Justice. But know this, once this starts, there's no turning back. You'll be going up against powerful people, people who won't hesitate to destroy you if they get the chance." Chris leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We're ready for that," he said. "We've come too far to back down now." The following weeks were a blur of meetings, interrogations, and depositions. Jake, Chris, and Emily were thrust into the center of a legal maelstrom, their every word, every action, scrutinized by lawyers, investigators, and the media. The story broke wide open, and the nation watched in stunned silence as the corruption scandal unraveled before their eyes. Footage of Jake standing in front of the courthouse, reporters shouting questions, microphones shoved in his face, became a staple of nightly news. Emily was interviewed by multiple outlets, her voice calm and unwavering as she recounted her husband's transformation, their journey from ignorance to action, from bystanders to whistleblowers. She became a symbol of strength, an advocate for change, and soon other families began to come forward, sharing their own stories of injustice, of loved ones wrongfully imprisoned, of lives torn apart by a corrupt system that cared more about protecting itself than serving the people. Chris worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating with federal agents, providing testimony, and connecting the dots that would bring the entire network crashing down. He became the face of the investigation, the one who had never given up, who had risked everything to shine a light on the darkness. And through it all, Jake fought his own battles. He faced disciplinary hearings, internal investigations, and the cold stares of former colleagues who saw him as a traitor. He endured the threats, the whispers, the graffiti scrawled on his car, the hate mail shoved into his mailbox. But he also found something else: support, solidarity, and a growing sense of purpose. People reached out, thanking him for his courage, telling him that because of him, they believed that change was possible. The day the trial began, Jake stood outside the courthouse, staring up at the imposing building, feeling the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. Chris and Emily stood beside him, each of them bruised, exhausted, but unbroken. They exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come, of the battles they'd fought and the ones still to come. The trial lasted for months, a grueling, exhausting process that tested their resolve to its very limits. But piece by piece, the case came together. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and the tangled web of corruption that had ensnared so many was laid bare for all to see. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell silent, guilty, on all counts. Jake felt tears prick his eyes, a tidal wave of emotion crashing over him. He reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly, as Chris placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They had done it. They had won. But more importantly, they had shown that it was possible to stand up against the darkness, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's actions could make a difference. In the days that followed, Jake faced the consequences of his choices. He was suspended from the force, pending an investigation into his own conduct, but he accepted it with a sense of peace, knowing that he had done the right thing, that he had finally found the courage to be the man he was meant to be. Chris received a commendation for his work, but more than that, he received something he had been seeking for years: acknowledgement, not just as an agent, but as a man who had fought for justice when it mattered most. Emily continued her advocacy work, becoming a leading voice in the movement for police reform, using her platform to push for change, to ensure that the lessons learned from their journey would not be forgotten. And as Jake stood on the steps of the courthouse looking out over the sea of faces, he felt a sense of hope. He saw people of all colors, all backgrounds, standing together, demanding change, demanding justice. And he knew in that moment that their fight was far from over. But for the first time in his life, Jake Miller felt ready. He was no longer a man defined by his past, by the mistakes he had made, or the darkness he had allowed to cloud his judgment. He was something else now, something better. He was a man who had chosen to stand up, to speak out, to fight for what was right, and that, he realized, was a fight worth fighting, no matter the cost.